Evans, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today in part 2 of our series on minoritized language and linguistic theory. The first one we had was with me. Today we have Professor Jonathan Bobaljik from Harvard University. On Tuesday at the same time, we'll have Professor Maria Polinsky from the University of Maryland. And on Wednesday, we'll have Professor Uju Anya from Carnegie Mellon University. So join us for those two as well. As you heard on Tuesday, the book contains a number of case studies of cases in linguistic theory where minoritized languages have, I would argue, radically changed our view of the structure of what is a possible and probable and likely human language and our models. And today, in direct connection with chapter 4, which is about ergative case, Jonathan Bobaljik will share some extensions, reflections, consequences, modifications, and further exemplifications of the dialogue between minoritized languages and linguistic theory with respect specifically to the phenomenon of ergativity. So Jonathan, thanks very much for participating in this, and please take it away.
Let me just share screen. Oh no. Oh, come on. Technical problems. Hang on just a second. This worked 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. So thank you for having me. This is an exciting topic. I gather it grows out of earlier NYIs. I was about to say earlier VNYIs, but this grows out of pre-VNYIs. So what I'd like to do today, as Andrew mentioned, is talk a little bit about ergativity, some older work, some more recent work, connecting it a little bit to the theme of this series in terms of minoritized languages. What I'll do today is got about 4 parts to it. I'll give a brief overview, a refresher course of ergativity and alignment more broadly. For many of you, this will be a refresher, but for some of you, it won't be. And for those of you who it's new, you'll get on board. And for those of you for whom it's a refresher, this is a chance to make sure we're all talking using the same terminology the same way. That's a theme that will come up at the end. I'll talk a little bit about the structural nature of ergative case. That's chapter 4 of Andrew's book. I won't re-present the material in that book, but I'll try to connect to it and summarize the points that he's made there. I have a slightly different take on it. I'll talk then about a case mismatch universal, a case agreement mismatch universal, a universal that appears to hold between case and agreement. That's some older work. And then in the interim, there have been some challenges to the validity of that universal. And so I'll defend the universal against the recent challenges and see if I can do all of this in 40 minutes. Okay, very quickly, briefly. Alignment, what's alignment? So alignment gives us the best way of talking about it, the standard way of talking about it is with reference to the major actants in clauses. So if you think of a transitive clause, transitivity is defined as having 2 arguments. We can think about them from English or Russian as the subject and object. We'll use A, so mnemonically agent or actor for the subject of a transitive clause, O for the object, and S for the sole argument of an intransitive clause. S does subject in 2 ways here. For a nominative accusative language, familiar if you're an English speaker, or German speaker, or Russian speaker, the subjects group together, the transitive and intransitive subject, and the object in terms of case is the odd one out, being marked accusative. What we know is that that's what we've known for a long time, is that that's not the only way that languages group these things. If you've got 3 entities, there's 5 ways to group them. That's the Bell number. One way is the nominative accusative pattern. You can also have a neutral pattern. English for noun phrases makes no case distinctions among the major cases. So it has neutral, there's no distinction. And the other one that's prominent, that's common, is the ergative absolutive distinction. Here's an example from a minority language, a minoritized language of Russia, Chukchi. And you see there's a transitive clause at the top and A and B are transitive clauses. And what you see is that the sole argument of an intransitive clause, however agentively you are running, or I am running, patterns together with the object rather than the subject of a transitive clause. So back to our overview, that's the ergative absolute of alignment. Not as common as nominative accusative, but out there. Slightly rarer one is the tripartite one where all three are distinct. And interestingly, unattested, noted already by Comrie in the 70s, is one where the transitive arguments are both marked the same, but distinct from an intransitive argument. Those 5 ways of grouping treat the F's, the subject, the sole argument of an intransitive clause monolithically, that is all the same. There is also a split, famously, where agentive sole arguments, the subject of run, pattern with transitive subjects, whereas undergoers, the subjects of unaccusatives, if you know that terminology, patient subjects, pattern with the object argument of a transitive. Won't be talking about that very much here, although we'll come back to it. Okay, so keeping with the theme of this lecture, here's a Walls table, 200 languages or so put together by Comrie, of the distribution of these languages, of these alignment types. The blue is the nominative accusative pattern, and the gray is the neutral pattern. Now, Comrie has English over here. Whoops, yeah, I can do that. English over here as neutral because this is about non-pronominal entities. And what you'll note immediately is that the blue and the gray predominate in the languages that have been the early major languages of, in particular, generative scholarship. So all of Western Europe is either blue or gray. Also East Asia, the major languages of East Asia, various Chinese languages, Japanese, Korean, etc., are either nominative, accusative, or neutral. So essentially all of what we know about the typology of alignment beyond the basic nominative accusative case comes from minoritized languages. Red is ergative here, yellow is the active case. Yellow is Basque, the language that Andrew mentions. And we see the ergativity predominantly in the Caucasus, indigenous languages of Australia, and North and South America. So there's a lot of exciting stuff out there, not just Basque control, and all of this has been built. This is one area in which minoritized languages have played a major role since the inception of discussing these things, actually, in the 19th century even. Since the discussion of these alignment patterns, they've been fairly central to the discussion. Okay, so returning to the overall typology quickly, let's take a brief moment and ask about the one pattern down here that's unattested. Comrie, as I mentioned, already noticed this. Why is that pattern unattested? And Comrie, Kibrik in Russia, following him, and others provided a functional explanation. They asked, what's the general purpose of case marking in the first place? And identified 2 ways of thinking about case marking. One is its indexing function, that it signals the semantic or theta role, thematic role of an entity, whether it's an agent, patient, etc. In GB, we inherit this as the notion of inherent case. And the alternative is what's called the differentiating function. And namely, that says, if you've got 2 arguments in a transitive clause, you got to know who's doing what to whom, right? Is the bear chasing you or are you chasing the bear? It's kind of important to know. And so these should be differentiated. One of them should be marked in a way that then conventionally distinguishes between the 2. The unattested pattern is the one that fails on both counts, and in particular fails to differentiate. There's no functional benefit to be gained by failing to distinguish the subject from the object of a transitive clause, but keeping the 2 of those separate from an intransitive clause. You already know which one is transitive and intransitive. And if you look back at the table, all of the attested patterns, if they make any distinction whatsoever, they distinguish the A from the O. Everything else is up for grabs, but at a minimum, you distinguish the A from the O. And this differentiating function is what's been inherited in GB, other generative theories, as the notion of structural case. That is, case that cares about structure rather than about meaning. It cares about transitivity. So that brings us to chapter 4 of Andrew's book. We skipped the first 3 chapters. And the title of that chapter is Why Ergative Case Requires Structure in Basque Control. And this identifies an argument, part of a larger set of arguments that for many, maybe all, most unclear languages with an ergative pattern, structure plays a key role in identifying, in accounting for or explaining the pattern, the distribution of case. Now that argument, so here's where I quibble. Andrew identifies Basque and Chol as the point at which minoritized languages changed the theory. I see it as more of an incremental accumulation of arguments over a number of years. And so rather than talking about Basque or Chol, I'll mention a couple of the others. From the beginning of the discussion of ergativity in the generative paradigm and in the non-generative paradigm, it's been recognized that even when you might suspect that there is a thematic component, an inherent case component to ergative case, it's still limited to structural configurations. And we see this because the arguments that are marked ergative in transitive clauses undergo case alternations. You might think of passive alternations in English, but these are other kinds of alternations where the one-time ergative argument with the same meaning will show up with absolutive if the clause is not transitive. And this is from, and I'll illustrate a couple of these. We know this from antipassives, from noun incorporation, from causative alternations, perception verbs, which are like ECM, which Andrew discusses from Basque, voice alternations in Austronesian. Oh, there's the Basque, I mentioned it twice, why not? So here's an example from a paper from Balinskaya and Nedyalkov from the 1980s, from Chukchi. Here we see a case where you have a transitive clause where father is spreading butter on the bread, butter is the object. Chukchi famously allows noun incorporation. You can take the direct object and put it into the verb. It becomes part of the verb word. And when that happens, the verb becomes intransitive. And father has exactly the same semantic contribution, or essentially the same semantic contribution. There's certainly the same theta role as it did in the transitive clause. But because the clause is intransitive, it loses the ergative case and has absolutive case. This is unexpected under standard views of inherent case within the GB paradigm. This is a structural diagnostic. Structure is part of the account. Can make the same point going back further from Inuktitut, famously a robustly ergative language. Transitive clause has ergative absolutive, but you can do what's called an antipassive if the object, loosely speaking, is new information rather than old information. It's expressed via an oblique. When it's expressed via an oblique, the clause is intransitive. The person is doing exactly the same thing in sentence B that they were doing in sentence A, but they're not marked with ergative in sentence B. Why? Because the clause is not transitive, and ergative marks the subject, the A argument of a transitive clause. The modern approaches to ergative as an inherent case, for example, by Julia Legate and Ellen Wolford, have acknowledged this and built a sort of a structural component into their specific treatment of lexical ergative case. But we can go further, and this is more recent work, and including the Basque work that Andrew cites. What's exciting about this, one of the incremental steps that comes up here, is that there are examples for which it seems that structure, transitivity, is not only necessary, but sufficient for the description of ergative case. And we see this from examples where non-agentive elements, for example, the sole argument of an unaccusative verb, a theme, the lowest thing on the thematic hierarchy, can get ergative if you can get it into the right configuration where it becomes a transitive subject. And that's something that's newer. That evidence starts around the Basque paper in 2014, and in parallel, an argument from Mark Baker from applicative of unaccusatives in Shipibo, also Nez Perce, Amy Rose Deal a little bit later. So the quick nutshell version of this, what's going on, why is it an argument? So in Shipibo, you have unaccusative verbs. These are the verbs with patient subjects. These are the subjects that thematically behave like the object of a transitive. Change of state undergoers like ripen. And of course, the subject of ripen has absolutive case, not ergative case, because it's a subject of an intransitive verb. So it gets absolutive case. But what Shipibo allows is you can add an applicative morpheme, which brings a new causal participant in, a benefactive or a malefactive. Now, it was believed for a while and is stated in print that unaccusative verbs can't have applicatives. Mark Baker is cited for that observation before he discovered Shipibo. Or he didn't discover Shipibo, before he discovered this data in Shipibo, realized the importance of this data. So what happens here is when you add an argument as an applicative, the applicativized argument, the benefactive, shows up as the object of the clause. The fruit is doing the same thing, it's undergoing the same change of state, but now you have a transitive clause, and so it becomes ergative. So this is a syntax talk. We need a tree. Here's a tree. If you look at this tree without the blue material, I'm holding my hand over the blue material so that you don't see the blue material, right? If you take this part, the blue part, out, you have a simple unaccusative. Object, underlying object raises to subject, it's intransitive and therefore gets absolutive. But when you add the applicative in, the neat thing about this construction, the thing that's unexpected, is it's not the highest argument that moves to subject position. It's still the lower one. Baker has a story Y, and Amy Rose Deal has a story for the analogous construction in those pairs. But what happens is the theme raises to subject position. You've got two arguments in a transitive clause, so the higher one is ergative. So what we find here is that, summarizing years of data and lots of intricate stuff into a couple of short bullet points, even if we say that ergative case doesn't have a common source, that there are multiple ways of getting to an ergative pattern. Masha Polinsky's book has a decent study, a decent number of languages that show strong arguments for different ways of getting there. What we do find is that structure appears to be necessary in the description. You need to have transitivity. And for some range of cases, this is where I wanted to say a decent number of cases, structure appears to be a sufficient part of the account, but the thematic role is not a part of the account. So again, coming back to the general point that Andrew makes, that for all of these arguments, both from the broad typology of case alignment to the specific arguments about how we want to analyze case and what's going on, almost all of the relevant languages are minoritized. The exception here is maybe Hindi Urdu, which we'll mention later as the largest one, but even that has not been a traditional large influence in the central generative literature. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk a little bit about theory. One way to think about this theoretically is to say, behind the scenes, as it were, there is a uniformity cross-linguistically such that subjects are more prominent than objects. And if you're in a generative type approach, you might express this structurally, that subjects see command objects at some level of representation. This might then get messed up with later by other things that happen, but this is at least some core piece of what's going on. Subjects see command objects, regardless of the alignment. Now, if you think then in terms of Comrie-esque or Kibrigsky ideas about how to approach this, you might say that the fundamental notion of differentiation is needed only in transitive clauses, and it marks, or Haspelmath's term, it flags, right? One of the two arguments. It takes the higher one, you call it ergative, and if it marks the lower one, we call it accusative. But the structure is at some fundamental point the same between the two of them. This captures the two major patterns because the unmarked argument, the argument that doesn't get marked, will fall into the unmarked case, which is the same one as the intransitive sole argument, because there's no reason to mark the sole argument. And again, this has been prominent in some recent generative approaches under the name of dependent case theory, but it has very clear analogs in the functional approaches from Comrie and Kibrik, also in the generative literature in Yip et al.'s case in tiers. I won't get any deeper than that into the theory. Let's just think about this as an implementation of the structural effect of ergativity. Now, you might say, and it was certainly explored for a while, is it true that all languages have subject over object, subject prominence over object prominence in this way, that in transitive clauses, the more agentive argument is more grammatically more prominent than the patientive argument? And the answer, and this has been commented on many, many times, I draw here from Dixon, is yes. No matter what else is going on in the languages, and there's things that vary, some things always show, if they show an asymmetry, they show the asymmetry of the transitive subject over the transitive object. And this is imperatives, control, and binding and reflexives. There's lots of neat things that happen in binding and reflexives. This is all embedded under an if, but if there's an asymmetry, it goes this way and never goes the other way. It's never a set of languages where objects are systematically on these criteria more prominent than the subject. There are other criteria where they are, but these ones work like that. So my favorite diagnostic for subjecthood is control. Here's an example, again, from Polinsky's book. This is from Cez. The unexpressed argument of a non-finite clause that's obligatorily co-referent with something in the matrix clause is the subject, and always and only the subject, regardless of the case marking it would have in a finite clause. So this cross-cuts the case pattern. Absolutives are pro when they're intransitive, but perfectly allowed when they're transitive. And conversely, pro can be either ergative or absolutive in terms of what it corresponds to. So we have strong evidence that there is a subject-object asymmetry, the same one that we see in nominative accusative languages, hiding behind the alignment pattern in ergative absolutive languages. Okay? And that'll come back again as an important point when we touch on the universal. So quickly, for a dependent case, or however we want to call this, the highlight is, in terms of the morphology of case, ergative and accusative form a natural class in that these are the marked cases or the dependent cases, in the sense that they depend on the structure. They depend on being in a transitive structure, as opposed to the unmarked cases, nominative or absolutive. But in terms of the syntax, the main natural class for the phenomena we just discussed, not all, is the notion of subject, which is subject as we know it, the highest theta role, more or less, right? So that can cross-cut the case hierarchy. For nominative accusative languages, these two things align. For ergative absolutive languages, these two considerations, these two natural classes cross with one another. Okay. So let's turn to agreement, because I'm going to tell you about case and agreement and the relation between the two. So very quickly, everything we've said about case, more or less alignment, happens for agreement as well. There are languages with nominative accusative agreement systems. There are languages with ergative absolutive agreement systems. So it says, which has come up a couple of times already, says is neat because it has an ergative absolutive case system and an ergative absolutive agreement system. The absolutive argument agrees. You see these in boxes here. It's the object of the transitive and the subject of the intransitive that trigger agreement on the verb, and not the subject of the transitive. But it doesn't have to be this way. Chomsky's speculation that case and agreement are two sides of the same coin doesn't always pan out. Languages like Chukchi and a bunch of others work differently. In Chukchi, you see that, at least for the prefixal component of agreement, the prefix picks out the subject and doesn't care about the case of the subject. So it doesn't pick out the absolutives. It picks out the subject, whether the subject is absolutive or ergative. So remember, subject-object, the patterning of subjects, transitive and intransitive subject together to the exclusion of the object, is what we call a nominative accusative system in alignment. So it's a nominative accusative alignment, but it's fundamentally the same thing. This is key as subject-object alignment. So you can have an ergative absolutive case pattern with subject-object alignment. But what you can't have is the opposite. So if you have an ergative absolutive case pattern, you find either an ergative absolutive agreement pattern or a nominative accusative agreement pattern, or various other things. You can mix two things in walls here. I did a table with numbers, but it gets too complex. But if you have a nominative accusative case pattern, you always have, if you have agreement, a nominative accusative agreement pattern, subject-object agreement pattern, and never an ergative absolutive pattern. Anderson noticed this in 1977 on a small sample, and it's been repeated over and over and over. Many people have reobserved this over increasingly large samples. Again, any shred of ergative absolutivity means you've got to be looking and bringing into the discussion the minoritized languages. They've been contributing to this debate from the get-go. This has been one of the areas where we've seen a lot. I'll add one little quick point as well. that all bets are off if a language has no overt case marking. There are languages with no overt case marking that do have ergative absolute agreement patterns. Johol, which is in the book, is one of those. But for languages that have overt case marking, we have this asymmetry. They don't have to match nominative case and agreement, but they can mismatch in only one way and not the other. And that's interesting. We want to know why that is. Right? So let me tell you why that is. I told you in 2008. In fact, Mark Baker, Julie Legate, and I all independently, more or less, we were emailing each other, proposed accounts of this that sort of roughly have the same flavor. So there must have been something in the air at around about that time that we all landed on this. Right? And the idea is something like this. We will say that what agreement targets in all languages, so let's take languages that just take a single argument to agree with, like says, which we saw. Languages that take a single argument to agree with will take the highest, the functionally highest accessible NP in the agreement domain. And we could spend time, it's whole different talks spelling out what these pieces mean. Just think about it as highest. Highest is subject over object. We had that tree earlier. And the control facts and others tell us that that subject-object asymmetry is always hiding there in the background. And so what's going to do the work is this notion of accessible. What does accessible mean? Well, let's say this is my way, Mark's way is a little bit different, Julie's way is a little bit different. But the key thing here is that case plays a role in accessibility. So there are languages in which only the unmarked case, NPs, are available for agreement, and you choose the highest among those. But there are other languages in which the structural case NPs, the unmarked case NPs, and the dependent case NPs, that is the ergative or the accusative, are accessible for agreement. This is a point of cross-linguistic variation. But once you set that at the language level, which one's available for agreement, then you simply mechanically choose the highest one, the highest accessible NP. Now, if you want to and haven't seen this before, you can do a thought exercise. This derives the universal. We've now got the universal, but I'll walk you through how and why. If you want to, you can sort of work this through. I can't see what you're doing. You can work on this in your, so while I'm walking through this. So let's think, so easy thing here, I'll jump ahead quickly. For a language like, say, Russian, which is a nominative accusative language, right? The nominative, to the extent that the nominative is always the subject, the nominative will always be the highest accessible agreement. And it doesn't matter whether accusative NPs are also accessible for agreement, because the subject is always higher than the object. You'll just always pick out the subject for agreement. So this is the piece of the puzzle that says if you have a nominative accusative case system, you can, to your heart's content, make other NPs accessible for agreement. But the highest one is always going to be the subject, the highest relevant one. So it's always going to be the one that triggers agreement. So you get a subject-object asymmetry, and you'll have a subject-object the same as nominative accusative. You'll have a nominative accusative agreement. The interesting work then is being done with the variation in ergative languages. So here's the classic generative description, or the description of Hindi-Urdu agreement patterns. This is from the 1970s. In the perfective clauses, past tense if you want, I'm taking a number of shortcuts, but you're getting the distilled version of this. In the perfective clauses, the subject is ergative, marked ne, and the object is absolutive, it's unmarked. In an imperfective clause, both arguments are unmarked. There's no morphological marking of either the subject or the object. Right? Cross-cutting this, there is the phenomenon of differential object marking. Animate or specific, or there's a bit of stuff going on here. Certain objects with particular characteristics, are marked dative. Now we know that use of data for differential object marking is extremely common cross-linguistically. Bosong's 1985 book establishes that for a large number of languages. The important thing is that differential object marking cross-cuts the previous distinction. It shows up in perfectives and in imperfectives. Doesn't matter what the clause is. So you get this marker. Right? So with that in mind, there's a very simple statement of what controls agreement in Hindi-Urdu, Namely, it's the highest unmarked argument. Done. And if there is no unmarked argument, so if you have an ergative subject and a differential object, differentially marked object, there's no unmarked object in the clause. It doesn't crash. Nod to Omer. You get a default agreement. This has been the. In fact, I know of no other characterization, theoretical characterization of Hindi Urdu agreement. This has been it for since the 70s. Yeah. So here's a schema version of it. In an imperfective clause, you have two unmarked arguments. There's some work being done here. It's the subject that agrees. Doesn't care. It's the highest unmarked object. We might say, oh, well, it's a subject that agrees because subjects agree. But in perfective clauses, the subjects are marked, and it's the object that agrees. Depending on what you believe about psych verbs, there are subject-like elements in psych verbs, psychological predicates that are dative marked. And when that happens, it's the object which is unmarked, which agrees. Okay? So it's the highest unmarked object. Now, the fun stuff happens when we compare Hindi with its relative Nepali. Nepali has schematically exactly the same case pattern, up to a whole bunch of differences. But we're putting aside the differences. It has the same case pattern, but with some phonological differences, some different elements. So the ergative in the perfective is marked le, ne, yeah, but the absolutive is unmarked. The imperfective is neutral with 0 marking. And there is differential object marking. The dative marks high animate specific objects, cross-cutting the previous distinction. But where Nepali differs from Hindi is that it's not the highest unmarked argument that controls agreement. It's the highest structural case argument that controls agreement. So structural case is ergative and absolutive, but not dative. Sorry, ergative and 0, ergative, what if you want to call it 0, but not dative. It makes a distinction there. And again, if none, then default. And so what you see here is, unlike Hindi, in the perfective, sorry, these have been vertically switched. Right? In the imperfective, you have two unmarked objects, two unmarked NPs, and it's the highest one that controls agreement. In the perfective, you mark the subject ergative. In Hindi, this means that the agreement moves down and picks out the unmarked element, the object, and when it's not differentially marked. But in Nepali, that doesn't happen. The ergative triggers agreement, whether or not it's marked ergative. So Nepali, in this case, is sort of like Chukchi, that it's got a subject-object agreement pattern rather than an ergative absolutive pattern. The quirk is that dative subjects don't agree. When you have a dative subject, then the object agrees. So we have a split. This is why I said between the structural cases and the lexical cases like dative. Lexical cases like dative in Nepali. Okay. Okay, so here's a real life example, an actual example. The subject is marked, is unmarked in the imperfective and marked in the perfective, but it triggers agreement regardless. So this is a difference between Nepali and Hindi. Yeah. So here we have a schema. This schematizes it. In both languages, it's the highest accessible NP that governs agreement. But where they differ is in what NPs count as accessible. And this follows a hierarchy. The unmarked case is always accessible, but the dependent case, accusative or ergative, varies cross-linguistically as to whether it's accessible or not. Okay? So that derives your universal. Okay? In a nominative accusative language, it doesn't matter whether the accusative is accessible or not. Because the nominative is always accessible, the highest accessible argument will always be the subject. So you will, the function highest accessible will always pick out the subject function, and you'll get a subject-object alignment in agreement. And subject-object is, of course, the same thing as nominative accusative. This is the patterning that we call nominative accusative. But for an ergative absolutive language, it matters whether or not the ergative case is accessible. If the ergative case is not accessible, the highest accessible argument can be the object, and you get the absolute pattern in agreement that we see in says and in Hindi. Important theoretical points: case and agreement are distinct. They're not two sides of the same coin. Second important theoretical point from this: agreement depends on case. You have to figure out what the case marking pattern is first, and that determines accessibility for agreement. So even derivationally, you need to have case marking happen before you calculate agreement marking. Again, that's the opposite of what Chomsky and something suggested. So again, here's places where, assuming we've all accepted the truth of this, where minoritized languages, Chukchi says, Hindi, Nepali, etc., have changed linguistic theory. Although, yeah, they changed it back to what it was before Chomsky made some proposals. Okay, now since this appeared, since the three of us had versions of this in 2008, I say since it appeared, since it had been made more prominent. Again, the observation goes back to Anderson in the 70s. Various people have challenged this. Amy Rose Deal challenged this in an overview article on ergativity in 2015, said, would be nice, but the universal is in fact incorrect. So, oops, that would be a problem. The theory would be nice, but it isn't right. And again, the challenges come, as ergative, from an interesting array of languages. And she mentions the Jê and Carib languages from Brazil, and a group of, a subgroup of Indo-Iranian language, Indo-Aryan languages related to Hindi and Nepali. So let's look at both of those cases quickly. One of them we can look at very quickly, and the other one will be less quickly. So the source that she cites, the Deal cites for this, for the Jê and Carib languages, says they're counter to the expected universal. Case marking is nominative, while verbal cross-referencing is absolutive. That's the cell that's marked as unattested in the previous table. So have I been lying to you? Okay. Well, So here's, if you go back, so the interesting thing is that the language that was cited for this is a language that both Mark Baker and I independently looked at when we were establishing, verifying Anderson and Dixon's conjecture. So something's weird there. So here's what's happening. The agreement on the verb, this is Canela, the agreement on the verb, so on the verb element, picks out the absolutive argument. The ergative argument is also marked, but it's marked on the TMA, let's call it an auxiliary. So there is an absolutive alignment to the bound pronominal markers on the verbs. Okay, yeah. The claim then, the interesting part, is that the pronouns show a nominative accusative case pattern. This is what Deal says. So what's the nominative accusative case pattern in the pronouns? So it turns out there is no morphological marking of pronouns. They don't morphologically distinguish their functions in the sentence. So if we think about case as the morphological marking, this is why Baker and I thought this lived in the cell with Chol and doesn't constitute a counterexample to the universal. But Gildea and Castro Alvarez identified distributional patterns that, despite the ergative absolutive alignment of agreement, show a subject-object asymmetry. Control in co-reference is one of these, right? Whether the subject is obligatory or not obligatory, and a word order difference is a subject-object pattern in word order. Now, there is a tradition of saying things like case in English noun phrases is expressed by word order. The nominative element comes before the verb and the accusative element comes after the verb. That's certainly a legitimate way about thinking about things. We say, what's the function of case? It's to distinguish the two arguments of a transitive clause. And we use word order where some other language uses morphology, but they're doing the same functional role. And so we'll give that the name case. But that's not the sense of case that proponents of the typology mean. Proponents of the typology about the mismatch, sorry, not typology. Proponents of the mismatch between case and agreement are talking about the more narrow sense of case as morphological marking. So we had a terminological mix-up, an easy one to make, with a good ground behind it, and with a nod to Martin Haspelmath, we need to be more careful about our terms. Now I'm being more careful about terms, and we're fine on that score. Okay, Indo-Aryan makes essentially the same point, I believe, but with a sort of an unexpected refinement here, something that we may not have realized before we sort of dug into this, although in a sense we should have. Yeah. So Here's the counterexample from Indo-Aryan. This is Kachi Gujarati, a variety of Gujarati. What you see is that in an imperfective and a perfective clause, there's no difference in the subject marking. So Hindi would have ergative here on the subject, so would Nepali. Kachi Gujarati has no difference in the marking of the noun. Right? But there is a difference in the agreement. In the imperfective, it's the subject that controls agreement. In the perfective, it's the object that controls agreement and the subject of an intransitive. There's an absolutive pattern to the agreement that correlates with the imperfective perfective alternation, just like these things do across Indo-Aryan or most of Indo-Aryan. But it happens without a morphological signal of the ergative case in the perfective subject. Okay? So that's neat. The question is this just another case of Chol? And the reason that Deal and others single this out as not being just another case of an unmarked pronoun or unmarked noun phrase having an ergative absolutive alignment is that there is differential object marking here, just like we saw in Hindi. But here, note that even when you do have differential object marking, you still have agreement with the object. Yeah? So unlike Hindi, where a differential object marking blocks agreement, Nepali, in Kachi Gujarati, it doesn't. Yeah? So the fact that objects can get marked and the fact that subjects don't is interpreted in this discussion as a nominative accusative pattern. Only objects have a piece on them, right? The only objects have a mark. Looks like a nominative accusative pattern, but it isn't. I think it isn't necessarily what we want to call a nominative accusative pattern. So I mentioned Chol. What was the point of Chol? You can have no case marking and still have ergative absolutive agreement. Such systems are well attested. And what that means is if you buy into the explanation I gave that the only way to get an ergative absolutive pattern in agreement is to be parasitic on a case pattern, then we have abstract case. We have case distinctions that are not signaled overtly. That's not a surprise. We know that from Russian. We know that from lots of languages, Icelandic, English, what have you. So take third declension nouns like Deutsch in Russian. It doesn't distinguish nominative from accusative, but the syntax distinguishes nominative from accusative. Deutsch das nicht, for daughter. Deutsch is accusative, even though it looks just like the nominative, it's still not the subject of the clause, it's still the accusative element. Okay? And that's widespread in Indo-Aryan. Many Indo-Aryan languages are losing the ergative contrast. So this is Marathi. Marathi shows no morphological difference in the first and second person pronouns between the absolutive and the ergative subject, but the agreement is still behaving as if that distinction were there. So that in and of itself is not a new challenge. If you believe that's a challenge, that there can be no case distinction that's not overtly morphologically signaled, then the paradigm collapses already on the basis of languages like Chol. So there's no new argument here. We needed to buy abstract case to get this off the ground in the first place. Marwari, one of the putative counterexamples, has a really neat twist to this. And I'm watching the clock, so I'm going to go quickly through it. Most of Indo-Aryan, case is really neat in Indo-Aryan. We talk about case, but there's two components to case. There's internal stem changes that not all elements undergo, and then there is a post position. And the post position marks the entire nominal phrase, and the internal changes may mark individual pieces, like now, like say, demonstratives and adjectives and nouns, etc. Like many Indo-Aryan languages, Marwari has suppletion in the pronouns or the demonstrative for case. You have one form that's used in the nominative, depending on masculine, feminine, proximate, distal, and a totally different stem that combines with the post positions to give you the oblique cases. Okay? That happens across Indo-Aryan, it's not surprising. But remember, Marwari is one of these ones that needs to be described as having an ergative absolutive distinction, even though erg is missing from this table. There is no ergative post position that's been lost. But what I don't know if this is Magyar or Magyar, noted in the 1980s is that you can use the oblique stem without a post position of the pronoun in this language, but only if it's in ergative function, the subject of a transitive clause, and not in the subject of an intransitive clause. So in order to understand the distribution, we need to posit a null or phonologically null ergative case. And guess what? The phonologically null ergative case triggers suppletion on the pronoun, just like every other non-nominative case, even though you can't see it. You can see its effects, but you can't see it. So that's a neat confirmatory piece of evidence for the general view that we need. So the last piece of the puzzle requires us only to go back to an earlier slide. When we talked about Hindi Urdu, we said, remember, Hindi Urdu is famous for having an alignment split. It has a neutral alignment in imperfective and has an ergative alignment in the perfective, as do many other Indo-Aryan languages. But it also has differential object marking which cross-cuts this. So to see the alignment pattern in this and many other languages, you filter out differential object marking. Differential object marking is a separate phenomenon from the underlying alignment. Yeah? An interesting piece of this is that cross-linguistically within Indo-Aryan, there's independent variation on whether differential object marking bleeds agreement on the objects. Yeah? So standard Gujarati, not Kutchi Gujarati, has the phenomenon that it has ergative marking. It has a clear ergative element. It's just like Hindi in that sense, different piece, but there's an element there. But unlike Hindi, when you mark both the subject and the object still agrees. So ergative is a marker and it knocks the NP out of the realm of accessibility. But differential object marking is different. It isn't. It's ignored for the purposes of agreement in Gujarati and not in Hindi. Moreover, remember, for all of these languages, like many cross-linguistically, differential object marking is always the same morphology as dative. But in Gujarati, there's a difference for agreement between differential object marking and dative. So true datives, ones where you want a dative case, so verbs like meet that take a dative argument, they can't agree with the dative. A dative can't control it. But a differential object, although it is morphologically the same as a dative case, morphosyntactically, as far as agreement is concerned, behaves like an unmarked object and not like a case-marked object, not like a dative object or any other object instrumental, something of this sort. Yeah? So if we put together what we knew independently about Marathi and standard Gujarati, we get Kutchi Gujarati. That is, we know independently from this family of languages and from others that you can have an ergative absolutive syntactic or morphosyntactic contrast that isn't morphologically expressed. In fact, this is widespread. Basque doesn't contrast them in the plural, but agreement cares about it. Inuktitut doesn't contrast them in the first and second person, but agreement cares about the difference, etc. So this is nothing new, that the ergative absolutive case function is not always overtly signaled. And differential object marking is something that cross-cuts alignment patterns and is not accusative case. So we get here something that when we put together those two pieces, we get exactly the pattern that we expect. We get a language that doesn't have an overt morphological contrast for ergative, has it underlyingly, which the agreement reflects, and the agreement, like in standard Gujarati and Rajasthani, doesn't care about difference. So if we're careful about our terminology, and we mean case to mean morphological form, then Canela is not a counterexample. As I've just said, this just repeats, we knew already case distinctions didn't need to be overt. Sometimes they're not overt. That was already a part of it. What we've learned here that's sort of new is that Dom is different from Ak, that when we're talking about accusative, we need to be careful to be talking about accusative case marking as opposed to differential object marking, which are two distinct phenomena, even though there's a large gray area overlap that we might worry about trying to figure out. So and I'll use Polinsky's word here, the tetrachoric case alignment pattern, that is 3 of the 4 cells are attested. The universal survives scrutiny with these qualifications. There it is again, if case is nominative accusative, then agreement is nominative accusative, that is subject object, and never ergative absolutive. So mismatches are possible, but mismatches are possible in only one direction. So to summarize back to the theme of the session, when minoritized languages change linguistic theory, some aspects of the theory of syntax have been subject to sample bias and have been very English or Indo-European centric. LGB's case theory notably conflated nominative, accusative, and subject-object and led us on a wild goose chase for a long time. But less well-known languages have always played a role in the debate. In particular, in the study of alignment patterns, they've been central to this debate because they're where all the differences come from. The friendly amendment I make to Andrew's book is that the influence of these languages is cumulative rather than punctual. It's not specific points where they have changed the theory, rather it's more an accumulation of arguments over a period of time and people being receptive to them in different ways. Nevertheless, the bias is still there. You can count the number of languages reflected in your latest journal. Renewed attention to the wonderful diverse languages of the world opens doors for exciting, I almost want to say new discoveries, although some of these are rediscoveries of things that are known outside of the canonical literature and need to be open to a broader dialogue to bring these things back in. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And thank you for guiding us through this. Thank you for the friendly amendments. I also, of course, think that all things are cumulative in science. I think maybe just perhaps the way that I had to center certain case studies may have highlighted them more than others, but thank you for that. And thanks for really expanding on this and contextualizing it. And let's open up the floor for any comments or questions that people may have. Hopefully they will appear in a mechanized order that'll make it relatively easy to call on people. Yeah, everyone go ahead. Feel free to take this opportunity to share anything about ergativity, alignment.
More counterexamples are welcome. People working on neat languages.
Nias
But
asks where we can find the file. Do you mean the slides?
Yes, I mean the slides, sorry.
Maybe we can put those in the readings. We'll see about that, right?
John's given a thumbs up.
We will. We tried to today, we failed, but we will succeed. They'll be up
So
in
there
the
is
general lectures folder.
I did send John for the general lectures folder, and they are up some written papers. One of them is so the response to the challenges to the universal is written up in a sort of a draft form, and that's available there. I almost said on my website. I'm not sure if it's on my website. My website is under reconstruction. I moved universities relatively recently and haven't re-established my website. But I also put Amy Rose's paper there, Amy Rose's Nez Perce paper that makes the point about derived unaccusatives, and something else. Oh, overview paper by myself and Mark Baker on inherent, why ergativity is sometimes inherent. Oh, slides just appeared in the chat. Cool. Cool. Yes, Paulina's question about marked nominatives. Excellent, excellent, excellent question. So, yeah. And this is another point where the problem with trying. Wait, I'm old. I can only do one thing at a time. Haha. Okay. So you all see the map. I think I can get back to the bigger version of the map. I don't know a better way to scroll than. We'll get there. We'll get there. We'll get there. Okay. Yeah. There's actually a subtle difference in the map between blue circles and blue diamonds. The blue are the nominative accusative languages. In the blue diamonds, the nominative case is marked. So Mark Baker does talk about this in his book. Koppe van Oork talks about this for Dinka, for other languages. There are languages with a nominative accusative pattern, but where it's the nominative that has an ending or a morphological form change, and the accusative not. This occurs sporadically in other languages as well. The one class of masculines in Icelandic does this, the word for horse, or Icelandic linguist Thráinsson, his first name is Huskud, but you write it as Huskudur because the ur is the nominative case marker, the accusative is Huskud. So the nominative is marked and the accusative is unmarked. So this is a neat area. Baker has a, let me see if I hang on, where I have this, anyway, doesn't matter. Baker has a particular view of this as various other stuff that's out there. I talked about this when I talked about dependent case as having a marked case and an unmarked case. As Haspelmath reminds us, that term is horrible for the number of different ways that it's been used in the literature. And I mean it here as a term of art that says which one is singled out in these alignment patterns. So the accusative is marked in that it is singled out and it is technically assigned, and the other two then grouped together. But there's no reason why that notion of singling out as markedness needs to be the same as actually bearing a phonological mark or not bearing a phonological mark, so plus versus zero. Be nice if they converge. They do in many, many, many cases, but they don't in all cases. Where'd the map go? And that was noted again already by, this one is Conway. So there are languages where the pattern is nominative accusative, or the pattern is absolutive ergative, and that these are the groupings, but it's not necessarily the case that the unmarked case is zero, and that the marked case is over. There are also, for example, an easy case of this, languages like Japanese, where both the marked and the unmarked case have a suffix. There's ga for nominative and o for accusative, right? So in Japanese, the o is marked with o. That's really useful that way. But yes, so that's a great question, and invites us invites us at the very least to make a terminological distinction here about marking the actual phonological appearance of something and markedness, which we might think of in terms of structure. So you might think of this, Pavel Zaha's work, nominative adds a piece on top of a noun phrase, accusative adds another piece on top of nominative, or ergative adds another piece on top of nominative. And in some languages, you see this transparent embedding, and in other languages, you don't see this transparent embedding. So the connection to actual phonological realization is a little bit loose. Mark suggests there may be more to it than that, but hang on, I can't use that there. But at the very least, that's something we need to acknowledge. Yeah, okay, and Masha points out some of these marked nominatives are actually topics. In fact, something that we, so lumping and splitting. Anytime we're talking about these broad typological categories, and I'm trying to do so in 45 minutes, which ended up being a little bit more than 45 minutes, we are taking a whole bunch of shortcuts and ignoring fine differences in details. The more languages you look at, the less detail you look at any one language in. And yes, it's not just the marked nominatives, but some of the others, some of the other case markers have double duty as, so the ergative marker in Jingaloo doubles as a focus marker. And one wonders if it's really fundamentally an ergative marker or really fundamentally part of the focus topic system. Hard to disentangle. Other examples of this. Nepali, I made a sort of a oral footnote. Nepali is a little bit less clean than Hindi in that it's not all transitive subjects that get marked ergative. People have looked at this in corpus studies and various kinds of online studies. And my understanding is that nobody knows exactly for sure when you do and don't put the ergative marker on a transitive subject. What we do know is that it only goes on transitive subjects. So well, yeah, there's some stuff with unergatives, but in general, it's got some additional qualifications. So anytime I present and have the space and the time to go into it, something like this, where we say, mark the high NP, mark the low NP, else do nothing. This is an abbreviation for what took Mark Baker 300 pages to sort through a bunch of qualifications and differences. And then the people that replied to Mark Baker said, yes, and you also missed this, and you missed this, and you missed this. Masha's book points out that some of the ergative markers seem to be more PP-like, and some tend to be morphologically more case-like. They appear to be DPs, and that this correlates with various things. And I didn't even scratch the surface of that.
Looks like Omar raised a hand.
Yeah, just to offer a small friendly amendment to what was just said. Some of these subtle things that Jonathan just talked about are that we need to distinguish are also sometimes the nexus of diachronic change. So I very briefly worked on Oromo, a Cushitic language, where there have been claims so Oromo is supposed to be a language where the nominative is marked and the accusative is null. And there are some claims in the literature that this is not case at all. It's something like anti-focus marking on the subject. And while I have no idea whether this used to be the case, and maybe it did in Proto-Cushitic, I worked with a speaker for which this was obviously not it was dissociable. The marking was dissociable from any discourse properties that we could envision testing. And so it's entirely possible, in my opinion, that there was a stage either of Oromo or maybe even earlier in the genealogy of the language family where this wasn't case marking. But for this speaker, it was. And it was still, of course, overt nominative and null on the direct object.
Cool, thank you. I'll echo on that. I'll carry that ball a little bit further. I cited it here somewhere, work by Ashwini Deo and Sharma, the co-author, on the typology of Indo-Aryan case and agreement systems. And that's another illustration of what Omar was just saying, that these pieces have changed over time. And so one of the things I mentioned is that some of the languages are losing the ergative absolute of morphological distinction, yet it's still there in the role it plays in filtering the agreement system. But if you look at Kutchi Gujarati, it's pretty reasonable to think that that's a nominative accusative system. No subject, no difference in the subject marking, and objects get a piece stuck on them. It looks like it's nominative accusative. Now it isn't, it's differential object marking, and the agreement system tells us that one of these is ergative absolute and the other is not. But you could imagine as the morphology erodes, and in particular, if one wonders about the functions of differential object marking, could a differential object marker become an accusative marker? Could the system realign itself? And there's one of the 6 patterns in Indo-Aryan is Bengali, which has lost all traces of ergativity and is a nominative accusative system, both in its agreement and, I'll stop there, in its agreement, and I don't know about its case properties. So yeah, these are, this connects nicely back to the Kutchi Gujarati point that one might not be surprised if Kutchi Gujarati begins to lose the evidence for these hidden ergative systems.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'll encourage all of you to look at the slides which are shared in our folder. I will congratulate all of you on a wonderful first week at the VNYI.
It's not over. We have class tomorrow.
Oh.
There's just in the Tuesday, Thursday series meets tomorrow. We have a movie night also, but our weeks never end.
Continue. the vibes for world peace. And we will see you at the next installment of the Minoritized Language series on Tuesday. Same bad time, same bad channel. So please join us. Just to highlight what that's going to be about. That will be related to the question of how we can rethink and also get back to the future with our theories of gender and noun classes based on re-examining data. So see you then, and thank you all for your enthusiasm and participation. And thank you especially, Jonathan. Tayeba, you have a question.
Oh, there's a question. Or no, it was a clap. That was it.
I think it was just a
There's no
clap.
question, sorry.
It was
Sorry.
a clap like this. It was this kind of clap.
Yeah,
Clap.
thank you.
Wonderful. Bye, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.